The skyline of New York City stretched like a kingdom beneath Magnus Hawthorne, a man who didn't just play the game, he owned the board. From his corner office at Hawthorne Global, he could see every building he had ever torn down, rebuilt, and stamped with his name. And tomorrow, one more would fall. Another piece of the old world erased, replaced by a glass and steel monument to his legacy. Just the way it should be. A deal, signed in stone. A sharp knock at the door. "Come in." Mira Lawson, his right-hand strategist, entered with her ever-present tablet in one hand and a look of mild concern in her eyes. Magnus leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Tell me everything's on schedule." Mira hesitated. "It is. Mostly." His jaw tensed. "Mostly?" Mira exhaled. "The Piermont District demolition is set for 8 a.m. The site is clear, except for one issue." She tapped the tablet. "An elderly tenant? Ezra Cole? He refused to take the buyout?" Magnus sighed, rubbing his temples. "Another one of these holdouts who thinks sentimental value is worth more than cold hard cash?" Mira didn't answer, because they both knew he wasn't asking. Magnus glanced out the window. "What happened to him?" "He was removed this afternoon," Mira replied. "Security escorted him out. He's got nowhere to go." Magnus took a slow sip of whiskey. "Not my problem." Mira hesitated. "Before he left, he said something to the crew." Magnus arched a brow. Mira glanced at her notes. "One day you'll remember me. And when you do, it will already be too late." A slow smirk tugged at Magnus's lips. "That's dramatic." Mira nodded. But for the first time, Magnus caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Something like doubt. But it didn't matter. The deal was done. By tomorrow, Piermont District would be nothing but rubble. And Ezra Cole? He'd just be another name, lost to time. The fall of an era. The next morning, Magnus stood at the demolition site, flanked by engineers, lawyers, and press cameras. The Piermont complex loomed before him, weathered, cracked, tired. To most it was history. To him, it was a liability, a place where the past refused to die. And he wasn't in the business of keeping ghosts alive. A reporter called out, camera lights flashing. "Mr. Hawthorne, what do you say to the people who claim you're erasing the heart of this city?" Magnus's smirk returned, polished and practiced. "This city doesn't need a heart," he said smoothly. "It needs a future." Applause. The cameras loved a good soundbite. He turned to the foreman. "Do it." The foreman lifted his hand, and the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Magnus glanced toward the barricades and froze, because standing there in the morning light was Ezra Cole. His coat was too thin for the cold. His shoulders were slightly hunched. But his eyes were sharp as knives. And for the first time in years, Magnus felt something that didn't belong in his world. A flicker of recognition. 7, 6, 5. Magnus shook it off. It didn't matter. 4, 3, 2, 1. With a final deafening boom, the building collapsed. The past was erased, and Ezra Cole was gone. Or so Magnus thought. Because the past, it never truly disappears. The dust had barely settled. The rubble of Piermont District lay in a crumbled heap behind security fences, a monument to progress. Or at least, that's what the headlines would say. But something felt off. And for the first time in Magnus Hawthorne's career, he couldn't just move on. Because the image of Ezra Cole, standing there, watching it all fall, refused to leave his mind. The first thread unraveled. Back in his office, Magnus scanned the morning papers, expecting the usual coverage. Magnus Hawthorne's next empire rises. The billionaire with a vision for tomorrow. But then, a headline stopped him cold. The forgotten man, Ezra Cole, left homeless after 80 years in the same home. Magnus stiffened. He clicked the article, skimming through exposés about displacement, greed, and corporate indifference. And then, a photo. A grainy black and white image of a young man in a military uniform, standing next to a boy. Magnus frowned, because something about that photo itched at the back of his mind. The caption read, Ezra Cole, decorated veteran, saved a child from an apartment fire in 1987. Magnus's heart stopped. He clicked the link, hands suddenly unsteady. The article expanded, showing another photo. One Magnus recognized instantly, because it was him. A terrified child, wrapped in a fireman's coat, being carried out of a burning building. And the man carrying him? Ezra Cole. A debt buried in smoke. Magnus felt cold. For years that night had been a blurry nightmare. The fire, the heat, the sound of his mother screaming, and the arms that pulled him from the flames. He had never known who saved him, never questioned how he survived when his parents hadn't. And now he had just destroyed the life of the man who had once saved his. Magnus slammed the laptop shut. The weight in his chest was unfamiliar. For the first time in his life, he couldn't buy his way out of this. The search for a ghost. By the time night fell, Magnus was in the back of his car, driving through the streets with Lena Carter in the passenger seat. "You sure about this?" she asked. Magnus didn't answer, because he wasn't. He didn't do guilt. He didn't do consequences. But here he was, tracking down a man who had every reason to hate him. Lena scrolled through her tablet. The last confirmed sighting of Cole was near Madison Park. Magnus's jaw tightened. A man who once had a home, a life, a history, now reduced to a name on a list of displaced souls. The car pulled up to the park. Cold wind blew through the empty benches. A few figures wrapped in tattered coats huddled under dim streetlights. Magnus had never noticed them before. But now all he could see was Ezra, and he had to find him. A face in the shadows. After an hour of searching, Magnus was about to call it off, until Lena froze. There. Magnus followed her gaze, and his breath caught. Sitting on a bench beneath a broken lamppost was Ezra Cole. His coat was even thinner than before. His hands, scarred from war and time, rested on his knees. But his eyes were still sharp, and when he looked up, he recognized Magnus instantly. A long silence stretched between them. Then, Ezra spoke. Well, he murmured, voice rough from the cold. If it isn't the boy I once saved, come back to finish the job. Magnus stiffened, because in that moment he knew this wouldn't be as simple as an apology, because some debts can't be paid with money. And this was a debt he would carry for the rest of his life. The wind howled through Madison Park, cutting through the thin layers of Ezra Cole's coat. But it wasn't the cold that made Magnus Hawthorne's stomach twist. It was the way Ezra looked at him, like a man staring at a ghost, like a man who had once saved a boy's life, only for that boy to grow up and erase his own. Magnus swallowed hard, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "I didn't know," he said, voice low. Ezra let out a dry, bitter chuckle. "Didn't know what?" he mused. "That I lived in that building? Or that I pulled you out of a fire 35 years ago?" Magnus clenched his jaw. "Both." Ezra nodded slowly, leaning back on the bench. "Hell of a thing, isn't it? To wake up one morning in your own home and go to sleep in the street, all because some billionaire wanted a shinier skyline." Magnus exhaled through his nose. It was the first time in his life that the weight of his choices felt real. The first time he saw the human cost of his empire. And it suffocated him. A conversation that shouldn't exist. Ezra's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his coat. Magnus noticed. He shouldn't have, but he did. "You don't have to be out here," Magnus said after a long pause. Ezra raised a brow. "And where exactly should I be?" Magnus shifted on his feet. "I can fix this." Ezra scoffed. "You think you can fix homelessness, Magnus? Or just me?" Magnus inhaled sharply, the sting of his own name on Ezra's lips feeling heavier than it should have. "I can buy you a place," Magnus offered, voice clipped. Ezra barked out a laugh. "Of course," he muttered, "because money fixes everything, doesn't it?" Magnus didn't respond, because for the first time in his life, he knew it didn't. Ezra's expression shifted, something colder creeping into his features. "You want to make this right?" he said, voice sharp. "Then tell me. Why did you come here, Magnus?" "Why do you care?" Magnus opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't know. All his life, he had been untouchable, above the consequences of his actions. But now, for the first time, he had found a crack in the empire he had built, and it was staring right at him, the weight of a name. Ezra sighed, shaking his head. "You know, I never told anyone who you were." Magnus stilled. Ezra's eyes flickered to him, knowing. "When I pulled you from that fire, I didn't do it for a thank you," he murmured. "Didn't do it to get my name in a paper. I did it because that's what a man does." Magnus's throat tightened, because Ezra had never used his name to gain anything, had never cashed in the debt he was owed, had never even tried to find the boy whose life he had saved. And yet, Magnus had taken everything from him. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, finally, Ezra stood, slow, controlled, and walked away. Magnus didn't stop him, because how could he? How could a man who had taken someone's entire world ever ask them to stay? The question that won't leave. That night, Magnus sat alone in his office, staring at the city. For the first time ever. It didn't feel like it belonged to him. His mind replayed Ezra's words on a loop. "Why do you care?" Magnus didn't have an answer. But maybe it was time he found one. The city felt different. For the first time, Magnus Hawthorne wasn't looking at skyscrapers as monuments to his power. He was looking at them as tombstones, each one built on the graves of people who had been pushed out, forgotten, erased. And now, for the first time in his life, he saw it. But seeing wasn't enough. He had to do something. A search that leads to nowhere. Magnus spent the next 2 days trying to find Ezra Cole. Lena called every shelter, sent his people to check the parks, even offered money for information. Nothing. Ezra was gone. Magnus had ruined everything he had left. And now, the one man who could help him make it right had disappeared into the city he had once fought for. Magnus wasn't used to being powerless, and he hated it. The ghosts of the past. On the third night, Magnus sat in his office, staring at an old photo on his desk. A child wrapped in a fireman's coat, the blurred face of the man who had saved him. And now, that man was homeless because of him. Magnus's fingers curled into a fist. Then, a knock at the door. Lena entered, her face unreadable. "You're not going to like this," she said. Magnus arched a brow. "Try me." She hesitated, then placed a manila folder on his desk. Magnus flipped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a medical report, and at the top, Ezra Cole's name. Magnus felt his stomach drop. The clock that never stops. "Where did you get this?" Magnus demanded. Lena's jaw tightened. "He checked into a free clinic last night. They ran his ID. One of my contacts flagged it." Magnus's grip on the paper tightened. His eyes scanned the report. and froze at the last few lines. Patient exhibits severe signs of malnutrition, pneumonia, and exposure-related illness. Further hospitalization recommended. Magnus stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. Where is he now? Lena exhaled. The clinic couldn't keep him. He refused treatment and left before they could admit him. Magnus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear that this time he was already too late. A desperate race. 15 minutes later, Magnus was back in his car, weaving through the city, retracing Ezra's steps. He checked every place Ezra had been before. Nothing. His mind kept going back to Ezra's words. You think money fixes everything, don't you? For the first time, Magnus understood. Ezra didn't want a check. He didn't want charity. He wanted to be seen, to be treated like a person, not a problem. And that meant, if Ezra wasn't in the places where people went for help, then he was in a place where no one would look for him at all. Magnus's pulse spiked as the realization hit. Take me back to Piermont, he ordered. Lena shot him a look. Magnus, that place is a construction site. Just do it. The driver didn't hesitate, because when Magnus Hawthorne gave an order, people listened, buried beneath the ruins. The site was dark when Magnus arrived, only a few security lights, casting long shadows over the rubble. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. The sound of the city hummed in the distance. But here, it was silent. Too silent. Magnus climbed over the broken remains of the building he had destroyed. Then, he saw him. Ezra Cole, sitting on the foundation where his home once stood. His coat was wrapped tightly around him, his shoulders shaking with the cold. Magnus's chest tightened. Ezra, he called. Ezra barely looked up. Thought I told you, he murmured. You're too late. Magnus took a step closer. You're sick. Ezra smirked weakly. You finally figured that out, huh? Magnus exhaled sharply. Let me help you. Ezra coughed, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? Magnus frowned. Get what? Ezra looked up at him, really looked at him. And when he spoke, his words were soft, but sharp as knives. You can't undo what's already been done. Magnus's stomach twisted, because for the first time, he believed it. The wind bit at Magnus Hawthorne's skin, but the cold was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. Ezra Cole sat hunched in the rubble of what was once his home, his coat barely shielding him from the night air. His breathing was shallow. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from exhaustion. Magnus had seen that look before, on men who had nothing left to lose, and that terrified him more than anything. A battle of wills. Magnus stepped forward, his voice controlled but firm. You need a doctor. Ezra gave him a hollow smirk. And you need a soul. Guess neither of us are getting what we want tonight. Magnus's jaw clenched. I'm not leaving you here. Ezra exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Why do you care, Magnus? Why now? Magnus opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had too many. Because Ezra had saved him. Because Ezra had never asked for anything in return. Because Magnus owed him a debt he could never repay. Finally, he settled on the only truth that mattered. Because I can't let you die out here. Ezra's gaze didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. And that was something. A line in the sand. Magnus crouched down, his voice dropping. Come with me, Ezra sighed. And go where exactly? I'll find you a place, a real one. Ezra's eyes narrowed. You think I care about a fancy apartment? Magnus hesitated. But I think you care about living. Ezra let out a bitter laugh. You really believe that? Magnus didn't blink. Yes. A silence stretched between them. Then, Ezra shivered, his body betraying him. Magnus reached for his phone. "I'm calling a doctor." Ezra's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Don't," he rasped. Magnus frowned. "You're sick." Ezra's fingers tightened. "I don't need a damn doctor." Magnus stared at him. "What do you need then?" Ezra swallowed hard. Then, finally, he spoke. "I need to matter again." Magnus's chest ached, because in all the billions he had made, in all the skyscrapers he had built, he had never felt a truth heavier than that. A different kind of offer. Magnus took a breath, choosing his next words carefully. "Then let's make something that matters." Ezra arched a brow. "You mean something you can put your name on?" Magnus shook his head. "Something we can put yours on." Ezra froze. Magnus pushed forward. "Piermont's gone. I can't change that, but I can build something better." Ezra's gaze hardened. "And what does that do for the people you already erased?" Magnus's voice was steady. "It gives them a place to come back to." Ezra searched his face for a lie, for a trick. But Magnus wasn't playing games. For the first time in his life, this wasn't about money. It was about making things right. Ezra looked away. The fight in his body was still there, but his bones were tired. And Magnus knew, if he left now, Ezra wouldn't make it through the night. Magnus straightened. "If you won't come with me, fine." He pulled off his coat, dropping it over Ezra's shoulders. "But I'm not leaving you here alone." Ezra tensed under the weight of the fabric. Magnus sat down next to him on the cold concrete. And together, they waited for the sunrise. The night stretched long and silent. Magnus Hawthorne sat beside Ezra Cole, his coat draped over the older man's shoulders, the city's cold pressing in around them. Ezra didn't speak. Neither did Magnus. Because some wounds weren't meant to be covered in words. But as the first hints of sunrise bled into the sky, Magnus made a decision, one that would change everything. The offer that couldn't be refused. By the time the city started to wake, Magnus had already made the call. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Ezra watched as Lena Carter stepped out, her sharp gaze sweeping over him. "You look like hell," she said. Ezra smirked weakly. "You should see the other guy." Magnus exhaled, standing. "Come with me, Ezra." Ezra didn't move. "You planning to fix me?" he muttered. Magnus shook his head. "I can't fix you," he admitted, "but I can give you a reason to keep going." Ezra studied him for a long moment. Then finally, "All right," he said. Magnus nodded, and for the first time, when he held out a hand, Ezra took it. A new beginning. 3 weeks later, Magnus stood in front of the press. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But he only focused on one thing: the blueprints in his hands. A new project. A different kind of project. The Cole Center for Community and Housing, built on the ashes of Piermont District. A place for those who had been pushed out, forgotten, erased. A place that wouldn't bear his name, but someone else's. Magnus cleared his throat. "When I tore down Piermont, I thought I was making way for something better," he said. "I was wrong." Silence. Raw. Unfiltered. "I took away a home from a man who once saved my life. A man who has spent his entire life giving to others. And it's time I do the same." The cameras kept rolling. The headlines would be brutal. But for once, Magnus didn't care. Because this wasn't about him, a name that will never be forgotten. Magnus found Ezra Cole standing near the construction site, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. "You really did it," Ezra murmured, staring at the blueprints. Magnus exhaled. "You said you wanted to matter again." Ezra huffed a laugh. And you put my damn name on a building? Magnus smirked. You wanted something more permanent than a check. Ezra shook his head. You're impossible. Magnus shrugged. So are you. For the first time in weeks, Ezra smiled. And just like that, the weight in Magnus's chest lifted. Because some debts can't be paid in money. They can only be repaid in action. And this was just the beginning. 1 year later, the Cole Center stood tall, its doors open, its rooms filled with those who had nowhere else to go. Magnus Hawthorne's name wasn't on the front, but it didn't need to be, because he knew what he had built. And for the first time in his life, he had built something that actually mattered. And Ezra, he was still there, still watching, still making sure that no one else got erased, because no one should be forgotten. Not anymore.